She was rushing to catch the elevator when she collided with the Billionaire CEO. One awkward moment sparked the love story of a lifetime. Her heels clicked frantically against the marble floor as papers scattered like autumn leaves, and in that split second when their eyes met, his startled blue gaze colliding with her mortified brown ones, Amora Williams had no idea she'd just crashed into her destiny. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now, let's get into the story. The morning sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bennett Tower, painting the pristine lobby in shades of gold and ambition. At exactly 7:47 a.m., Amora Williams burst through the revolving doors, her breath forming small clouds in the air-conditioned sanctuary of Manhattan's most prestigious business district. She was already 13 minutes late. Her coffee-brown skin glistened with a thin sheen of perspiration despite the October chill, and her carefully straightened hair had begun to rebel against the humidity of her hurried subway ride. The navy-blue blazer she'd ironed the night before now clung to her shoulders, wrinkled from her sprint up 3 flights of subway stairs when the escalator had decided to break down at the worst possible moment. Not today, she whispered to herself, clutching her leather portfolio against her chest like armor. Not on presentation day. The Bennett Tower lobby stretched before her like a cathedral of capitalism, 40 feet of gleaming marble, punctuated by abstract sculptures that probably cost more than her annual salary. She'd worked in this building for 8 months now, but the opulence still took her breath away. Every surface seemed to whisper of money and power, from the imported Italian marble beneath her feet to the crystal chandelier that hung like a frozen firework 30 feet above her head. Amora's heels, her good heels, the ones she'd splurged on when she'd landed this job at Morrison & Associates, clicked against the marble with increasing desperation as she navigated through the early morning crowd of suited executives and important-looking people with important-looking briefcases. She could feel the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. This presentation wasn't just another client meeting. This was her shot, her one chance to prove that the girl from Detroit who'd worked 3 jobs to put herself through Howard University belonged in these gleaming towers of corporate America. What do you think drives someone to push themselves so hard for success? Drop a comment below and share what motivates you to chase your dreams, no matter the obstacles. The elevator bank loomed ahead, a row of polished steel doors that might as well have been the gates of heaven. She could see the numbers above the middle elevator, 15, 16, 17. It was coming down, and if she missed it, the next one might not arrive for another 5 minutes. 5 minutes she absolutely did not have. Her phone buzzed against her hip. A text from her best friend Keisha. "Girl, you better not be late for your big day. You got this. Flex biceps." If only Keisha knew how not got this she felt right now. 43 floors above, Christopher Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city wake up beneath him. At 34, he commanded a business empire that spanned 3 continents, but this morning he felt every one of his years pressing down on his shoulders like the weight of the sky. The Wall Street Journal lay folded on his mahogany desk, the headlines still burning in his mind. Bennett Enterprises under federal investigation. Fraud allegations rock corporate giant. His grandfather's company, the legacy that had been built over 70 years, was being torn apart by accusations and innuendo. Christopher's reflection stared back at him from the window, steel-grey eyes that had inherited his grandfather's intensity, dark hair already showing threads of silver at the temples despite his youth, and the kind of sharp jawline that photographers loved, but which right now was clenched tight with tension. He'd been in the office since 5 a.m., fielding calls from lawyers, investors, and board members who all wanted the same thing. Answers he didn't have and reassurances he couldn't give. The investigation was a witch hunt. He was certain of it, but certainty didn't stop stock prices from plummeting or stop his phone from ringing every 30 seconds. His assistant, Margaret, a woman who'd worked for the Bennett family for 23 years, knocked softly on his door. "Mr. Bennett? Your 8:30 with the Morrison team is confirmed. Should I have them wait in conference room A?" Christopher straightened his Italian silk tie and slipped into his navy suit jacket. The Morrison presentation was supposed to be routine, a mid-level consulting firm pitching some efficiency improvements for their overseas operations. Normally, he'd delegate this kind of meeting to a VP, but today he needed the distraction. He needed to focus on something other than the lawyers circling his company like vultures. "I'll meet them myself," he said, grabbing his leather portfolio. "Conference room A at 8:30. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. Christopher Bennett didn't attend preliminary presentations with consulting firms, but she simply nodded. "Of course, sir." As Christopher walked toward the private elevator that would take him down to the 35th floor conference rooms, he had no idea that 43 floors below, a young woman was about to change the trajectory of his entire life. The elevator in the lobby chimed softly as it reached the ground floor. Amora was still 20 feet away, but she could see the doors beginning to slide open. Her pace quickened from a fast walk to something approaching a run, her portfolio bouncing against her hip as she dodged between a man in a charcoal suit and a woman carrying an armload of files. "Hold the elevator," she called out, her voice echoing off the marble walls. The elevator was filling quickly. This was the morning rush, and everyone in Bennett Tower had somewhere important to be. She could see backs of heads, expensive suits, the occasional flash of jewelry. The doors began their slow, inevitable slide closed. "Please." Amora's voice cracked slightly with desperation. A hand shot out to stop the doors, manicured fingers with clear polish belonging to a woman in a cream-colored blazer. The doors shuddered and reopened. "Thank you," Amora gasped as she slipped into the elevator, pressing herself against the back wall. The space was crowded, filled with the scent of expensive cologne and the rustle of important documents. She found herself wedged between a tall man in a charcoal suit and a woman who smelled like gardenias and looked like she stepped out of a fashion magazine. Her phone buzzed again. Another text, this time from her supervisor. "Conference room A, 8:30. Don't be late, Williams. This could make your career." Amora closed her eyes and took a deep breath. 8th floor. She was going to the 8th floor to deliver the presentation she'd worked on for 3 weeks straight. The presentation that would either launch her career into the stratosphere or confirm every doubt anyone had ever had about whether she belonged in this world. The elevator began its ascent, carrying her toward a destiny she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. Meanwhile, Christopher's private elevator descended from the executive floors, its polished interior reflecting his tense expression. He was thinking about numbers, stock prices, legal fees, the cost of a scandal that could destroy everything his family had built. He was thinking about his grandfather, who'd started Bennett Enterprises with nothing but a small loan and an unshakable belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. He wasn't thinking about elevator doors or coffee or the possibility that sometimes the most important moments in life arrive disguised as accidents. Both elevators moved through the steel and concrete heart of Bennett Tower, carrying two people whose lives were about to collide in the most unexpected way. Amora clutched her portfolio, her presentation notes, and her dreams. Christopher carried his burdens, his responsibilities, and a loneliness he'd never acknowledged to anyone, not even himself. The building hummed around them, 4 to 7 floors of ambition and aspiration, of dreams being built and fortunes being made. And somewhere in the mechanical precision of elevators and the careful choreography of corporate life, fate was preparing to write a love story that would change everything. The elevator carrying Amora lurched to a stop at the 8th floor with a soft ding that might as well have been a gunshot to her already frayed nerves. The doors slid open to reveal a corridor that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed beige was the color of productivity and success. 8th floor, announced the woman in the cream blazer who had saved Amora's morning by holding the elevator. Marketing, human resources, and conference rooms A through E. Amora murmured her thanks and stepped out into the hallway, immediately checking her phone. 8:28 a.m. She had exactly 2 minutes to find conference room A, check her appearance, and transform herself from the frazzled woman who'd sprinted through Manhattan into the polished professional who deserved to be taken seriously. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with frosted glass doors and motivational artwork that probably cost more than her monthly rent. She turned left, following the brass nameplate indicators, her heels clicking against the polished concrete floor with what she hoped sounded like confidence rather than panic. Conference room A. Conference room A. Her portfolio felt heavier with each step, weighted down not just with presentation materials, but with the dreams of everyone who had ever believed in her. Her grandmother, who'd worked double shifts at the hospital so Amora could afford college textbooks. Her mother, who'd driven her to every internship interview in a car that barely ran. Her professors at Howard, who'd seen something in the girl from Detroit's East Side that maybe she was only just beginning to see in herself. 3 doors down from the elevator, she found it, Conference Room A. Through the frosted glass, she could see the blurred outlines of people already seated around what looked like an enormous table. Her stomach performed an Olympic-level gymnastics routine. She paused outside the door, using the reflection in the brass nameplate to check her appearance one last time. Her lipstick had survived the morning commute, her blazer was only slightly wrinkled, and her hair, well, her hair would have to do. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and reached for the door handle. That's when she heard the ding of another elevator. Christopher Bennett stepped out of his private elevator into the 8th floor corridor, his mind still churning through the morning's crisis management calls. The federal investigation was moving faster than his legal team had anticipated, and the board meeting scheduled for Friday was going to be a battlefield. He needed this Morrison presentation to go smoothly, one normal, productive meeting in a day that had already proven to be anything but normal. He glanced at his Rolex. 8:29, perfect timing. The corridor was empty except for a woman standing outside Conference Room A. She had her back to him, and he could see her shoulders rise and fall as she took what looked like a steadying breath. Something about her posture, the careful way she held herself, the slight tension in her frame, suggested she was nervous about whatever meeting awaited her behind that frosted glass door. Christopher felt an unexpected flicker of something. Empathy, maybe. He remembered being nervous before big meetings, back when Bennett Enterprises was still something he had to prove himself worthy of rather than something he'd been born to inherit. That felt like a lifetime ago. The woman reached for the door handle, and Christopher quickened his pace slightly. If she was part of the Morrison team, it would be awkward if he arrived after his own meeting had already started. That's when his phone rang. The sound cut through the corridors quiet like a chainsaw through silk. Christopher glanced at the caller ID and felt his jaw clench. His head of legal, probably with more bad news about the investigation. He needed to take this call, but he also needed to get to the meeting. He answered on the second ring, his voice low and tense. James, what is it? Christopher, we have a problem. The SEC wants to move up the timeline for. Hold on. Christopher stopped walking and pressed the phone closer to his ear, trying to process what his lawyer was telling him while simultaneously calculating how this new development would affect every other crisis currently exploding in his life. The woman at Conference Room A pushed open the door and disappeared inside. Christopher could hear the murmur of voices greeting her, professional, cordial, the sound of business being conducted. The sound of normalcy that felt increasingly foreign in his current reality. What do you mean they want to move up the timeline? He asked, leaning against the wall and closing his eyes. We had until Friday. They want everything by Wednesday. All financial records, all correspondence, all board meeting minutes for the past 3 years. Christopher, that's impossible. That's impossible. Christopher's free hand ran through his hair, probably destroying the careful styling his barber had achieved that morning. There's no way we can compile 3 years of documentation in. His phone buzzed with another call. Then another. The screen lit up with names he recognized. Board members, investors, journalists who'd somehow gotten his private number. The vultures were circling, and they could smell blood in the water. James, I have to go. Set up a meeting with the full legal team for this afternoon. We'll figure this out. He ended the call and stared at his phone screen, watching new notifications pop up like some kind of digital nightmare. Email after email, call after call, each one probably carrying fresh bad news or demands for explanations he didn't have. For just a moment, Christopher Bennett, the man who controlled a billion-dollar empire, who'd been featured on the cover of Forbes twice before his 35th birthday, felt completely and utterly lost. That's when the door to Conference Room A opened again. Amora backed out of the conference room, her face flushed with embarrassment and her hands fumbling with her portfolio. The meeting had started without her. Apparently, there had been a scheduling mix-up, and they'd moved the presentation 15 minutes earlier. Her supervisor's assistant had tried to call her, but in the chaos of her morning commute, she'd missed it completely. "I'm so sorry," she was saying to someone inside the room, her voice carrying the particular kind of mortification that comes from professional humiliation. "I can reschedule for this afternoon, or tomorrow morning, whatever works best for." "Ms. Williams, we appreciate your understanding," came a voice from inside the room. Her supervisor, probably, though Amora couldn't bring herself to look directly at him. "We'll have Margaret reach out about rescheduling." The door closed with a soft click that sounded like the death knell of her career. Amora stood in the hallway, her portfolio clutched against her chest, feeling like she might spontaneously combust from sheer embarrassment. 8 months of proving herself, 3 weeks of preparation, and she'd blown it because of a subway delay and a scheduling mix-up that she should have confirmed yesterday. She needed air. She needed to get out of this hallway before anyone else saw her standing there like a monument to professional failure. The elevator was 30 feet away. If she could just make it to the elevator, she could disappear into the bowels of Bennett Tower and figure out how to salvage what was left of her dignity. She turned around fast, too fast, and started walking toward the elevator bank with the kind of determined pace that suggested she had somewhere important to be, even though the only place she needed to be was anywhere but here. That's when she collided with Christopher Bennett. The impact sent papers flying in every direction, a snow flurry of documents and business cards and presentation notes that seemed to hang in the air for one impossible moment before gravity remembered its job. Amora's portfolio flew open, disgorging the presentation she'd spent 3 weeks perfecting, charts and graphs and carefully formatted slides that now drifted to the polished floor like confetti at the world's most depressing parade. "Oh my God," Amora gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't see you. I was." She looked up into the bluest eyes she'd ever seen. Time didn't stop, exactly, but it definitely shifted into a lower gear. Christopher Bennett, though she didn't know his name yet, stood frozen in front of her, his expensive suit slightly rumpled from their collision, his phone still clutched in one hand and an expression of complete surprise on his face that would have been almost comical if Amora hadn't been busy dying of embarrassment. He was tall, taller than she'd realized from her brief glimpse before the collision, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it and the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers or movie screens. Even in her mortified state, some distant part of Amora's brain registered that this was possibly the most attractive man she'd ever seen in person. "I'm so sorry," she said again, dropping to her knees and frantically gathering the scattered papers. "I wasn't paying attention. I was upset about my meeting, and God, I'm such an idiot." Christopher watched her scramble around on the floor, collecting documents that looked like charts and business proposals, and felt something shift in his chest. She was beautiful. That was the first thing his brain managed to process through the shock of the collision. Her skin was the color of warm honey, and when she'd looked up at him, her eyes had been the deepest brown he'd ever seen, wide with horror and embarrassment. But it wasn't just her beauty that made him pause. It was the way she moved, quick and graceful even in her panic. The way she apologized, genuinely distressed about bumping into a stranger. The way she called herself an idiot with such sincere self-recrimination that he felt an unexpected urge to tell her she was wrong. When was the last time someone had apologized to him for anything? When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen just a person, rather than a net worth or a business opportunity or a target for investigation? "Here," he said, surprising himself by kneeling down beside her. "Let me help." Their hands brushed as they both reached for the same document, a presentation slide about cost efficiency improvements in overseas operations. The contact was brief, barely a whisper of skin against skin, but it sent an electric shock up Christopher's arm that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with the woman kneeling beside him on the polished floor of Bennett Tower's 8th floor corridor. "You really don't have to," Amora said, not looking at him. She was gathering papers with the efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste time on self-pity. "This is my mess. Literally and figuratively." "Bad meeting?" Christopher asked, surprising himself again. He didn't make small talk with strangers. He barely made small talk with people he knew. But something about this woman, maybe the way she was attacking the paper gathering with such determined energy, made him want to know what had put that look of frustration in her dark eyes. Amora paused in her collecting and looked at him. Really looked at him, this time. He was even more handsome up close, with the kind of bone structure that suggested good genetics and the kind of expensive suit that suggested good fortune. His eyes were kind, though, which wasn't what she'd expected from someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate lifestyle magazine. The worst, she admitted. I was late because of subway delays, and apparently they rescheduled the meeting 15 minutes earlier and I missed the call. So I showed up just in time to be completely humiliated in front of my supervisor and a room full of clients. What's the most embarrassing professional moment you've ever experienced? Sometimes our worst days lead to our best opportunities. Share your story in the comments below. Christopher felt his eyebrows rise. Morrison and Associates. Amora blinked. How did you? Then her eyes widened as understanding dawned. Oh no. Oh no, no, no. Please tell me you're not. You weren't supposed to be in that meeting, were you? Actually, Christopher said, standing and offering her his hand. I was supposed to be in that meeting. I'm Christopher Bennett. The color drained from Amora's face so quickly that Christopher was genuinely concerned she might faint. She stared at his outstretched hand like it might bite her, then looked up at his face with an expression of such complete horror that he almost smiled despite everything. You're Christopher Bennett, she repeated slowly. As in Bennett Enterprises. As in the CEO of the company that owns this building. Guilty as charged. And I just... She gestured vaguely at the scattered papers, at her rumpled appearance, at the general disaster zone that surrounded them. I just crashed into you and made you pick up my papers off the floor. Technically, we crashed into each other, Christopher said, still holding out his hand. And I offered to help with the papers. Amora stared at his hand for another moment, then reached up and let him help her to her feet. His grip was warm and firm, and when she was standing again, she realized he was even taller than she'd thought. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, which was doing nothing good for her already fragile composure. I should probably mention, Christopher continued, that I was coming to your meeting. The Morrison presentation. If it was possible for someone to turn even paler, Amora managed it. You were coming to my meeting. My meeting that I missed because I was late. My meeting that I completely humiliated myself at. Your meeting that was rescheduled without anyone bothering to tell you, Christopher corrected. Which, if you ask me, is pretty poor form on Morrison's part. Amora clutched her reconstructed portfolio against her chest and wondered if it was possible to die of embarrassment. Because if it was, she was definitely a goner. Not only had she missed the most important presentation of her career, she'd literally run into the CEO of the company she'd been trying to impress. The CEO who was now standing in front of her, being inexplicably kind about the whole disaster. Mr. Bennett, she said, trying to summon what was left of her professional dignity. I am so incredibly sorry about all of this. The collision, the missed meeting, She gestured helplessly. Everything. This is not how I normally conduct business, I promise. Christopher looked at her, really looked at her. At the way she held herself despite her obvious mortification, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the careful professional appearance that couldn't quite hide a warmth that seemed to radiate from her very core. At the presentation materials clutched in her arms, materials he now realized he was curious to see. What if I told you, he said slowly, that the meeting isn't actually over? Amora's eyebrows drew together in confusion. I'm sorry. The Morrison presentation. What if I told you that I hadn't actually made it to the meeting yet when we had our collision? What if I told you that as far as I'm concerned, the real presentation hasn't started yet? Amora stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. I don't understand. Christopher glanced back toward conference room A, then at his phone, which was still buzzing with new crisis updates, then back at the woman in front of him. For reasons he couldn't quite articulate, the thought of sitting through a standard corporate presentation in a sterile conference room while his company fell apart around him seemed unbearable. But the thought of hearing what Amora Williams had to say, hearing it properly, without the interference of scheduling mix-ups and corporate protocol, suddenly seemed like exactly what he needed. I have an idea, he said. And you're probably going to think I'm crazy. More crazy than literally running into the CEO of Bennett Enterprises in a hallway. Amara asked, and Christopher caught a glimpse of humor in her eyes that made something warm unfurl in his chest. Much more crazy than that, he confirmed. What would you say to giving your presentation over coffee? Real coffee, not whatever they serve in the conference room. Somewhere we can actually hear ourselves think. Amara opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. You want me to give my presentation, over coffee? I want to hear what you have to say without a room full of executives and whatever crisis is blowing up my phone every 30 seconds, Christopher said, surprising himself with his honesty. I want to hear your ideas, Ms. Williams. The ones that were important enough to make you sprint through Manhattan to get here on time. For a moment, Amara just stared at him. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke, right? CEOs of billion-dollar companies didn't invite junior consultants for coffee after collision-based meet cuties in corporate hallways. Things like this didn't happen to girls from Detroit who'd fought for everything they'd ever achieved. But Christopher Bennett was looking at her with those impossible blue eyes, and his expression was completely serious, and something in his voice suggested that this impromptu coffee meeting might be as much about what he needed as what she needed. Okay, she heard herself saying. Yes. I would like that very much. Christopher smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd managed in weeks, and Amara felt her heart do something acrobatic in her chest. There's a cafe on the corner, he said. Antonelli's. Do you know it? I know it, Amara said, though she'd never been able to afford to actually eat there. Meet me there in 10 minutes, Christopher said. And Ms. Williams? Bring those presentation materials. All of them. He started walking toward his private elevator, then paused and turned back. And Amara? Her name sounded different in his voice, warmer somehow. For what it's worth, I think Morrison & Associates just made the biggest mistake of their corporate lives. Then he was gone, disappeared behind the closing doors of his private elevator, leaving Amara standing in the hallway surrounded by the lingering scent of expensive cologne and the impossible reality that her worst professional day might just have turned into something extraordinary. She looked down at her portfolio, at the presentation she'd worked on for 3 weeks, at the dreams and hopes and carefully researched recommendations that had scattered across the floor just minutes before. 10 minutes to Antonelli's. 10 minutes to pull herself together and figure out how to give the presentation of her life to a man who had just turned her entire world upside down with a simple collision and an unexpected kindness. Amara Williams straightened her shoulders, smoothed her blazer, and headed for the elevator. She had a billionaire CEO to impress, and somehow, impossibly, she was starting to believe she actually could. Antonelli's cafe occupied the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street like a small piece of Italy that had been carefully transplanted into the heart of Manhattan's business district. With its exposed brick walls, hand-painted tiles, and the constant whisper of the espresso machine, it was the kind of place where deals were made over perfectly crafted cappuccinos and where the scent of fresh-baked biscotti could make even the most hardened corporate executive remember what it felt like to be human. Amara arrived first, clutching her portfolio and trying not to hyperventilate. She'd spent the 10-minute walk from Bennett Tower alternating between disbelief and panic. This couldn't be real. Christopher Bennett, the Christopher Bennett, whose face graced business magazines and whose company was worth more than the GDP of small countries, did not invite random consultants for coffee. Especially not random consultants who'd literally crashed into him and scattered their presentation materials across his building's hallway like some kind of professional disaster movie. But here she was, standing in the doorway of Antonelli's, breathing in the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans and watching impossibly well-dressed people conduct impossibly important business over tiny cups and delicate pastries. Table for one, asked the hostess, a woman with silver hair and the kind of Italian accent that made every word sound like poetry. Actually, I'm meeting someone, Amara said, her voice coming out smaller than she'd intended. Christopher Bennett. The hostess's eyebrows rose slightly, whether in recognition of the name or surprise that someone like Amara would be meeting someone like Christopher Bennett, she couldn't tell. Ah, sigh. Mr. Bennett called ahead. Corner table, very private. This way, please. The corner table turned out to be tucked into an alcove near the back of the cafe, partially hidden behind a decorative screen painted with scenes of the Italian countryside. It was intimate without being romantic, private without being secretive, the perfect setting for a business meeting that wasn't quite a business meeting. Amora settled into the plush velvet chair and tried to calm her racing heart. Through the large windows, she could see Bennett Tower rising into the sky like a monument to everything she'd been working toward her entire adult life. Success. Security. The chance to prove that where you came from didn't have to determine where you ended up. Her phone buzzed with a text from Keisha. How did the presentation go? Did you blow their minds with your brilliance? Amora stared at the message, trying to figure out how to explain that she'd missed her presentation, crashed into a billionaire, and was now waiting to give said presentation in a cafe that probably charged more for a single cup of coffee than she usually spent on lunch for a week. Before she could formulate a response, Christopher Bennett walked through the cafe's front door. The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Conversations didn't exactly stop, but they shifted. Voices became more subdued, glances became more frequent, and there was a subtle reorganization of the room's energy that happened when someone truly powerful entered a space. Christopher seemed oblivious to it all, scanning the cafe until his eyes found Amora in the corner alcove. When he smiled, that same genuine smile from the hallway, Amora felt her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with professional nerves and everything to do with the way his entire face transformed when he looked at her. "Ms. Williams," he said as he approached the table, and she noticed he'd loosened his tie slightly and rolled up his shirt sleeves. The small changes made him look less like a corporate icon and more like, well, like a man. An incredibly attractive man who was looking at her like she was the most interesting thing that had happened to him all day. "Mr. Bennett," she replied, standing to shake his hand. His grip was warm and firm, and he held on just a moment longer than strictly professional. "Christopher, please," he said as they both settled into their chairs. "I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you?" The hostess appeared almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting in the wings. "Mr. Bennett, the usual. Please, Elena, and whatever the lady would like." Amora glanced at the menu, her eyes widening slightly at the prices. Even the regular coffee cost more than she typically spent on, well, coffee. "Just a regular coffee, please. Black." Elena's expression suggested that ordering regular black coffee at Antonelli's was roughly equivalent to ordering a hot dog at a five-star restaurant, but she simply nodded. Of course. When they were alone, Christopher leaned back in his chair and studied Amora with an expression she couldn't quite read. "So," he said, "Amora Williams, tell me something about yourself that isn't in your professional bio." The question caught her off guard. She'd been prepared to launch into her presentation, to discuss cost efficiency improvements and operational optimization. She hadn't been prepared for this, whatever this was. "I'm sorry. Your presentation can wait," Christopher said, and she noticed he'd turned his phone face down on the table, giving her his complete attention. "I want to know who you are, where you're from, what makes you get up in the morning and fight subway delays to make it to meetings in buildings like mine." Amora felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't think my personal background is really relevant to." "It's relevant to me," Christopher interrupted gently. "Humor me." Their coffee arrived, his an elaborate cappuccino with foam art that looked like a tiny leaf, hers a simple black coffee in a cup that probably cost more than her monthly MetroCard. Elena disappeared again, leaving them cocooned in their corner alcove with the soft murmur of Italian jazz playing in the background. Amora took a sip of her coffee and nearly sighed with pleasure. Whatever they charged for it, it was worth every penny. "I'm from Detroit," she said finally. "East Side. My mom worked 2 jobs, one at a factory, one cleaning offices at night. My grandmother was a nurse at Detroit General for 37 years. Christopher listened without interrupting, his blue eyes focused entirely on her face. "I went to Howard on a partial scholarship and worked in the campus library to cover the rest. Graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration and a minor in international relations." She paused, then added with a small smile, "I also make a mean sweet potato pie and I know every word to every Motown song ever recorded." "Motown, huh?" Christopher's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "I would not have guessed that." "What would you have guessed?" "Classical." Maybe jazz. Something sophisticated and, I don't know, expensive. Amora laughed, actually laughed, and Christopher felt something warm settle in his chest at the sound. Mr. Bennett, Christopher, I think you might have me confused with someone who grew up with money. No, Christopher said quietly. I don't think I do. There was something in his voice that made Amora look at him more closely. In the soft lighting of the cafe, she could see lines of tension around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that spoke of stress and pressure and sleepless nights. For all his wealth and power, Christopher Bennett looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. What about you? She asked. What's something about you that isn't in Forbes magazine? Christopher's laugh was shorter, less genuine than hers had been. You read Forbes? Research, Amora said. When you're trying to impress Bennett Enterprises, you learn everything you can about Bennett Enterprises, including the fact that you took over as CEO when you were 28 after your father died, that you've expanded the company into 15 new markets, and that you were named one of Forbes' 30 under 33 years running. All very flattering, Christopher said, and all very incomplete. How so? Christopher turned his coffee cup in its saucer, watching the foam art dissolve. Forbes doesn't mention that I haven't taken a real vacation in 6 years, or that I eat most of my meals at my desk, or that I can't remember the last time I had a conversation with someone who wasn't either trying to sell me something or ask me for something. He looked up at her then, and Amora saw something vulnerable flicker across his features. They also don't mention that my company is currently under federal investigation for fraud allegations that could destroy everything my grandfather built. Amora's eyes widened. She'd heard rumors, of course, whispers in the financial news about investigations and SEC inquiries, but she hadn't realized how serious it was. I'm sorry. That must be incredibly difficult. It is, Christopher admitted. And the worst part is, I know we haven't done anything wrong. But in today's business climate, accusations can be just as damaging as actual guilt. Sometimes more so. Have you ever faced a situation where your reputation was on the line through no fault of your own? How did you handle the pressure? Share your experience in the comments below. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Amora found herself studying Christopher's face, noting the way his jaw clenched when he talked about the investigation, the way his fingers drummed against the table when he wasn't actively controlling them. He was nervous, she realized. This powerful, wealthy, successful man was nervous. Can I ask you something? She said. Shoot. Why did you invite me here? Really? Christopher considered the question, absently straightening his already straight tie. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. This morning has been challenging. Crisis management, legal calls, board members questioning every decision I've made for the past 3 years. And then I crashed into you in that hallway. I crashed into you, Amora corrected. We crashed into each other, Christopher said with a small smile. And for just a moment, when you looked up at me with those eyes, when you apologized like you actually meant it, like you saw me as a person rather than a net worth or a business opportunity, I remembered what it felt like to have a normal human interaction. Amora felt her breath catch. And you thought coffee would be normal. I thought coffee would be honest, Christopher said. No corporate politics, no hidden agendas, no lawyers or board members or SEC investigators. Just conversation. Between two people who apparently both have more at stake than anyone realizes. What do you mean? Christopher leaned forward slightly, his eyes searching her face. That presentation you were rushing to give this morning. It's important to you. Career-makingly important. It wasn't a question, but Amora nodded anyway. It's everything I've been working toward since I graduated. The chance to prove that I belong in this world, that I can compete with people who've had every advantage I've had to fight for. And if it doesn't go well? Amora's laugh was brittle. Then I go back to Detroit with my tail between my legs and prove right everyone who ever said I was reaching too high. Christopher studied her for a long moment. What if I told you that you've already proven them wrong? I haven't given you my presentation yet. You don't need to, Christopher said. I've been in business for over a decade, Amora. I've met with hundreds of consultants, analysts, and advisors. Most of them are all Polish and no substance. But you You ran through Manhattan in the rain to make a meeting that had been rescheduled without your knowledge. You apologized for a collision that was as much my fault as yours. You asked about my reputation being on the line instead of trying to use it to your advantage. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers where they rested beside her coffee cup. The contact sent an electric shock up Amora's arm that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with the way Christopher was looking at her. "You're not like the others," he said quietly. "And that's either going to be the best thing that's happened to my company in years, or the most dangerous thing that's happened to me personally." Amora's mouth went dry. "Dangerous how?" Christopher's thumb traced across her knuckles, so lightly she might have imagined it. "Because you make me want things I can't afford to want. Because sitting here with you feels more real than anything that's happened to me in months. Because when you look at me, I forget that I'm supposed to be untouchable." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibility and desire and the kind of tension that made Amora's skin feel too tight for her body. She was acutely aware of everything: the warmth of Christopher's fingers against hers, the way his eyes had darkened to the color of storm clouds, the fact that they were in a public cafe having what felt like the most intimate conversation of her life. "Christopher," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. His phone buzzed against the table, harsh and insistent. Then it buzzed again. And again. The spell broke. Christopher's hand jerked away from hers as he glanced at the screen, and Amora watched his expression shift from vulnerable to guarded in the space of a heartbeat. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice returning to its professional cadence. "I have to. This is my head of legal, and with everything that's happening." "Of course," Amora said quickly, pulling her hands back into her lap. "I understand." But as Christopher answered his phone and his attention shifted to whatever crisis was exploding in his ear, Amora felt the magic of the moment dissipate like smoke. She was suddenly, acutely aware of where she was, in an expensive cafe with a man whose life operated on a completely different level from hers, whose problems were measured in billions of dollars and federal investigations while hers were measured in subway delays and missed opportunities. What had she been thinking? That Christopher Bennett was actually interested in her as anything more than a momentary distraction from his corporate troubles. That a man who could buy and sell her entire neighborhood was genuinely attracted to a woman who shopped at Target and rode the subway to work. "No, James, that's not what I said," Christopher was saying into his phone, his free hand running through his hair in obvious frustration. "I said we'd cooperate with the investigation, not that we'd hand over proprietary information without proper legal review." Amora watched him transform back into the billionaire CEO she'd read about in Forbes. Sharp, commanding, untouchable. The man who'd touched her fingers so gently, who'd looked at her like she was something precious, seemed to have vanished entirely. She glanced at her portfolio, at the presentation materials she'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. Suddenly, the idea of pitching cost-efficiency improvements to a man who was fielding calls about federal investigations seemed almost laughably insignificant. "I should go," she said quietly when Christopher paused in his conversation. He looked at her, his expression conflicted. "Amora, wait." "No, it's fine," she said, gathering her portfolio and standing. "You have important things to deal with, and I've already taken up too much of your time." "That's not." Christopher's phone buzzed again, another call coming through. His jaw clenched. "Can you give me just 1 minute? Please?" Amora looked at him, really looked at him. At the tension in his shoulders, the stress lines around his eyes, the way he held his phone like it was both a lifeline and a weapon. This was his reality. Crisis management and federal investigations and billion-dollar decisions that affected thousands of people. She was a consultant from Detroit who'd missed her morning meeting and spilled coffee on her blazer. What had she expected? "It's okay," she said, forcing a smile. "Really? Thank you for the coffee, Christopher. And, good luck with everything." She turned to leave, but Christopher's voice stopped her. "Amora." She looked back, and for just a moment, she saw him again, not the CEO, not the billionaire, but the man who'd helped her gather scattered papers in a hallway and looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in his world. "This isn't over," he said, his eyes holding hers despite the voice in his ear demanding his attention. "We're not over." Amora's heart did something acrobatic in her chest, but she forced herself to keep walking. Because maybe they weren't over, but they weren't exactly begun either. And until Christopher Bennett figured out whether he wanted the untouchable CEO or the man who'd held her hand across a cafe table, she had her own life to figure out. The cool October air hit her face as she stepped out of Antonelli's, and she realized she was shaking. Whether from the cold, the caffeine, or the lingering effects of whatever had just happened between her and Christopher Bennett, she couldn't tell. Her phone buzzed with another text from Keisha. "Girl, you're killing me with the suspense. How did it go?" Amora stared at the message, then typed back, "I have absolutely no idea." But as she walked toward the subway, portfolio clutched against her chest and the taste of perfect coffee still on her lips, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything in her life had just changed. Whether for better or worse remained to be seen. Behind her, through the windows of Antonelli's, Christopher Bennett was still on his phone, dealing with lawyers and investigators and the slow-motion implosion of his corporate empire. But his eyes kept drifting to the door where Amora Williams had disappeared, and for the first time in years, he found himself wondering if there were some things more important than business. Some things worth fighting for that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Some things that might be worth risking everything to keep. 3 days after the collision that changed everything, Christopher Bennett sat in his corner office 43 floors above the streets of Manhattan, staring at a stack of legal documents that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics for all the attention he was paying them. The federal investigation was moving at warp speed. The SEC had seized financial records dating back 5 years. 3 board members had called emergency meetings to discuss leadership transitions. The stock price had dropped another 12 points overnight, and financial journalists were circling Bennett Enterprises like sharks who'd caught the scent of blood in the water. By any rational measure, this should have been the most stressful week of Christopher's life. His grandfather's legacy, his family's reputation, everything he'd worked for since taking over the company, all of it balanced on a knife's edge, ready to topple into ruin if he made one wrong move. So why couldn't he stop thinking about the way Amora Williams had looked at him across a cafe table? Why did he keep remembering the warmth of her fingers under his, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the way she'd laughed when he'd mentioned Motown music? "Mr. Bennett." Margaret's voice came through the intercom, carefully professional despite the chaos swirling around the executive floors. "The legal team is here for the 4 o'clock meeting." Christopher glanced at his Rolex. 4:15. He'd been sitting here for 15 minutes, supposedly reviewing depositions, actually reliving the moment when Amora had said his name like it meant something more than a signature on corporate documents. "Send them in," he said, straightening his tie and trying to summon the focus that had made him one of the youngest CEOs in Fortune 500 history. James Morrison, his head of legal, no relation to Morrison and Associates, led the parade of suits into the office. Behind him came Sandra Wexler from external counsel, 2 junior associates whose names Christopher could never remember, and Patricia Vance, the crisis management consultant they'd hired to handle media relations. "Christopher," James said without preamble, "we need to talk about the deposition schedule. The prosecution wants you in front of the grand jury by Friday." "That's impossible," Christopher replied automatically. "We haven't had time to prepare properly, Anne." "It's not a request," Sandra interrupted. "It's a subpoena. If you don't appear voluntarily, they'll have federal marshals escort you there." The words should have hit Christopher like a physical blow. A grand jury subpoena was serious, the kind of serious that could destroy a man's life even if he was completely innocent. But instead of fear or anger, Christopher felt nothing. A strange detachment, like he was watching someone else's life implode from a safe distance. "Fine," he said. "What do we need to do?" For the next hour, they talked strategy, plea negotiations, asset protection, media messaging. The lawyers spoke in their precise, bloodless language about reputation management and risk mitigation, reducing Christopher's life to a series of calculated moves designed to minimize damage. Christopher nodded at appropriate moments, asked relevant questions, signed documents that needed signing. But part of his mind, a larger part than he cared to admit, kept drifting to a different conversation entirely. To coffee that tasted like heaven and a woman who'd asked him about things that weren't in Forbes magazine. When had he last talked to someone who saw him as more than a corporate entity? When had he last felt human? Christopher. Patricia's sharp voice cut through his wandering thoughts. Are you listening to this? Of course, he lied smoothly. You were discussing the media strategy for Friday's statement. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. She was too good at her job to be fooled by corporate doublespeak. But she continued. As I was saying, we need to control the narrative. No impromptu interviews, no off-the-cuff statements to reporters. Everything goes through our communications team. Understood. And Christopher? James leaned forward, his expression grave. I know this is difficult, but for the next few weeks, maybe months, you need to be careful about associations. Any relationships, business or personal, that might be seen as compromising or inappropriate could be used against us. What do you mean? Christopher asked, though something cold was already settling in his stomach. I mean you need to be Caesar's wife, Sandra said bluntly. Beyond reproach. Above suspicion. No new business partnerships. No charitable commitments. No romantic entanglements that might give prosecutors ammunition. The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of Manhattan traffic 43 floors below. Christopher stared at his legal team. These people he paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to protect his interests, and felt something twist in his chest. I see, he said quietly. It's temporary, James added quickly. Once this investigation is resolved, once we clear your name, you can resume normal activities. But right now, we need you to be invisible except when we want you to be visible. Normal activities. As if having coffee with a beautiful, intelligent woman was some kind of liability to be managed rather than the first real thing that had happened to him in years. Christopher's phone buzzed against the conference table. A text message from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Bennett, this is Amora Williams. I wanted to thank you again for yesterday and to let you know that I've submitted my resignation to Morrison & Associates. I think it's time for me to explore other opportunities. I hope everything works out with your situation. The words hit Christopher like a punch to the solar plexus. Amora had quit her job. The presentation she'd worked 3 weeks on, the career opportunity that had meant everything to her, she'd walked away from all of it. Because of him? Because of what had happened between them? Because she'd realized, like his lawyers were now telling him, that associating with him was more liability than opportunity? Excuse me, Christopher said, standing abruptly. I need a moment. He walked to the windows overlooking the city, his phone still in his hand, Amora's message glowing on the screen like an accusation. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with life, millions of people pursuing their dreams, building their lives, falling in love, taking risks that mattered more than stock prices or SEC investigations. When had he stopped being one of those people? When had his life become so sanitized, so controlled, so empty of anything that actually mattered? Christopher. James's voice was carefully neutral. Is everything all right? Christopher turned back to face his legal team, these people whose job it was to protect him from the consequences of being human. Tell me something, he said. If I beat this investigation, when I beat it, what exactly am I going back to? The lawyers exchanged glances. I'm not sure I understand the question, Patricia said. My life, Christopher clarified. When this is over, when my reputation is restored and the stock price recovers and everything goes back to normal, what kind of life am I protecting? A very successful one, Sandra said slowly. You're the CEO of a billion-dollar company, Christopher. You have resources, influence, opportunities that most people can only dream of. And what else? Another pause. I'm sorry. Christopher laughed, but there was no humor in it. What else? Besides the company, besides the money, besides the influence, what else is in my life worth protecting? The silence stretched uncomfortably, because the answer, Christopher realized, was nothing, or next to nothing. His life was Bennett Enterprises and Bennett Enterprises was his life, and somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that there was supposed to be more. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his assistant. Mr. Bennett, there's a young woman here to see you. Says her name is Amora Williams and that you're expecting her? Should I send her up? Christopher's heart started beating faster. Amora was here, in his building. After resigning from her job, after walking away from everything she'd worked for, she'd come to see him. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I'm afraid we'll have to continue this later." "Christopher, we're not finished," James began. "Yes," Christopher said, his voice carrying the authority that had made him a CEO before his 30th birthday. "We are." He was already walking toward the door when Patricia's voice stopped him. "Christopher, remember what we discussed? About associations. About being careful." Christopher paused, his hand on the door handle. For a moment, he wavered. These people were trying to protect him, trying to save his company, trying to preserve everything his grandfather had built. The smart play, the safe play, was to listen to them. But when had Christopher Bennett ever made the safe play? "Patricia," he said without turning around, "with all due respect, there are some things more important than optics." Then he was gone, leaving his legal team staring after him with expressions of professional horror. Sometimes we have to choose between what's safe and what's right, between protecting what we have and pursuing what we need. What's the biggest risk you've ever taken for love? Share your story in the comments below. Margaret looked up from her desk as Christopher emerged from his office, straightening his tie and running a hand through his hair. "Mr. Bennett, I wasn't sure if you wanted me to." "Send her up," Christopher said. "Immediately." "Sir, the legal team is still." "The legal team can wait," Christopher said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "This is more important." 5 minutes later, the elevator doors opened to reveal Amora Williams, and Christopher felt his breath catch in his throat. She was wearing a simple black dress that hugged her curves in all the right places, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in the professional style she'd worn to their coffee meeting. She looked beautiful, confident, and completely out of place in the sterile corporate environment of the executive floors. She also looked nervous. "Christopher," she said as she stepped off the elevator, her voice carefully controlled. "Thank you for seeing me." "Amora." Her name felt like a prayer on his lips. "I got your text. You resigned." "I did." She lifted her chin slightly, and Christopher saw a flash of the steel that had driven her from Detroit to Manhattan, from scholarship student to consultant to whatever she was becoming next. "I realized that working for a company that would reschedule an important meeting without bothering to notify all participants probably wasn't the best fit for my professional growth." Christopher felt his mouth curve into a smile. "That's one way to put it." "I also realized," Amora continued, her voice softer now, "that there are some opportunities worth more than job security. Some connections worth more than career advancement." "Amora." "I'm not finished." She took a step closer, close enough that Christopher could smell her perfume, something light and floral that made him think of summer gardens and lazy Sunday mornings. "I know about the investigation, Christopher. I know about the federal subpoena and the grand jury and all of it." Christopher's jaw clenched. "The media has been thorough in their coverage. I also know that your lawyers probably told you to stay away from anyone who might complicate your situation. Anyone who might be seen as a liability or a distraction." "They might have mentioned something along those lines," Christopher admitted. Amora nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "So I came here to tell you something. To make something very clear." "What's that?" She stepped closer again, so close now that Christopher could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could count the individual lashes that framed them. "I came to tell you that I don't care about any of it. The investigation, the media attention, the risk to my reputation or my career. I don't care about any of it because what happened between us in that cafe, what's happening between us right now, is the most real thing I've felt in years." Christopher's heart was beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Amora, you don't understand what you're saying. If you're associated with me right now, it could destroy your career before it even begins. The media, the prosecutors, they'll tear apart anyone in my orbit." "Let them try," Amora said fiercely. "I've been underestimated my entire life, Christopher. By teachers who thought a girl from Detroit couldn't make it to Howard. By classmates who thought I didn't belong in their world. By supervisors who saw my address and assumed I wasn't serious about my career. I'm not afraid of people who think they can tear me down." "This is different," Christopher said desperately. "This is bigger than anything you've faced before." "Maybe," Amora agreed. But you know what I learned in that cafe? I learned that you're worth it. The man who helped me pick up scattered papers, who listened to me talk about my grandmother and Motown music, who looked at me like I was something precious, that man is worth fighting for. Christopher felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he'd forgotten it existed. You could have anyone, Amora. Someone without federal investigators breathing down his neck. Someone who could give you the life you deserve without dragging you through a media circus. I don't want anyone else, Amora said simply. I want the man who makes me feel like I can conquer the world just by believing in myself. I want the man who sees me, really sees me, not just what I could do for his company or his reputation. I want you, Christopher. All of you. The billionaire CEO and the man who drinks cappuccinos and gets phone calls that stress him out and looks at me like I'm the answer to a question he didn't know he was asking. Christopher stared at her, this incredible woman who'd walked into his building and his life and turned everything upside down in the space of 3 days. This woman who was offering him something he'd never had, someone who wanted him for himself, not for what he could provide or achieve or represent. The timing couldn't be worse, he said. But he was already reaching for her hands. The timing is perfect, Amora corrected, lacing their fingers together. Because if we can make it through this, through federal investigations and media scrutiny, and whatever else the world throws at us, we can make it through anything. Christopher lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. My lawyers are going to hate this. Are you planning to let your lawyers run your personal life? No, Christopher said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. No, I'm not. Good, Amora said, stepping even closer. Because I have some ideas about how we could spend your personal time. Christopher felt his pulse jump. Amora, I need you to understand what you're getting into. This investigation could go on for months. There will be reporters, photographers, people digging into every aspect of our relationship. They'll question your motives, your background, your qualifications. They'll try to turn our connection into something sordid or calculating. And what will you do when that happens? Christopher looked into her eyes, those beautiful, brave, intelligent eyes, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. I'll tell them that Amora Williams is the smartest, strongest, most incredible woman I've ever met. I'll tell them that she makes me want to be a better man, a better CEO, a better human being. I'll tell them that loving her is the best decision I've ever made. Loving me. Amora's voice was barely a whisper. Christopher's hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones. I'm falling in love with you, Amora Williams. Completely, helplessly, irrevocably. And I don't care who knows it. Christopher. I love the way you apologize when you're nervous. I love the way you hold yourself like you're ready to take on the world. I love that you quit your job because you believed we were worth more than playing it safe. I love that you're here, in my office, telling me that you're willing to fight for this when any rational person would run as far as possible in the opposite direction. Amora's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you too, she whispered. I love that you helped me gather my scattered papers. I love that you listened to me talk about Detroit like it was the most important place on earth. I love that you're strong enough to run a billion-dollar company, but gentle enough to hold my hand across a cafe table. I love that you're willing to risk everything for something real. Christopher leaned down, resting his forehead against hers. This is crazy, you know that, right? We've known each other for 3 days. 3 days, and I'm ready to take on the federal government for the chance to see where this goes. The best love stories usually start with something crazy, Amora said, her hands sliding up to rest against his chest. Boy meets girl in a hallway collision. Papers go flying. Coffee gets involved. Billionaire realizes that some things are more valuable than stock prices. And how do the best love stories end? Christopher asked, his lips just inches from hers. With the boy and girl deciding that whatever comes next, they are better facing it together. Christopher closed the distance between them, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted like coffee and possibility, and the kind of forever that makes people write songs and build empires and believe in happily ever after. Amora melted against him, her hands fisting in his expensive shirt, and Christopher thought dimly that his lawyers were going to have collective heart attacks when they found out about this. He didn't care. Let them have their heart attacks. Let the prosecutors investigate. Let the media speculate. Let the board members panic and the stock prices fluctuate and the whole corporate world lose its collective mind. Because for the first time in years, maybe for the first time in his life, Christopher Bennett had found something worth more than all of it combined. He'd found love, and he'd found it with a woman brave enough to crash into his world and strong enough to stay when things got complicated. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Amora smiled up at him with an expression that could have powered the entire city. "So," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "What happens now?" Christopher smiled back, the first genuinely happy smile he'd managed in months. "Now we figure out how to save my company, clear my name, and convince the world that the best thing that ever happened to Bennett Enterprises was a consultant from Detroit who wasn't afraid to crash into the CEO." "Sounds like a plan," Amora said. "But Christopher..." "Yes. Next time, we're having our strategy meetings somewhere with better coffee than your conference room." Christopher threw back his head and laughed, really laughed, for the first time since the investigation had begun. And as he held Amora Williams in his arms 43 floors above Manhattan, he realized that whatever came next, they were going to face it together. The best love stories, after all, usually started with something crazy. And this one was just getting started. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bennett Tower's 43rd floor, casting golden rectangles across the polished mahogany of Christopher's desk. But this morning, Christopher Bennett wasn't behind that desk reviewing quarterly reports or fielding crisis management calls. Instead, he was standing at the windows with his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened, watching the city wake up beneath him while Amora Williams made herself at home in his office. The quarterly efficiency report shows a 23% improvement in overseas operations, Amora was saying, her laptop balanced on her knees as she sat cross-legged in the leather chair that had once been reserved exclusively for visiting dignitaries and Fortune 500 CEOs. "And the new supply chain protocols we implemented have reduced costs by $2.3 million annually." Christopher turned away from the windows, unable to suppress his smile at the sight of her. 6 months of dating Christopher Bennett had done nothing to dim Amora's professional intensity or her ability to turn his corporate fortress into something that felt remarkably like home. She was wearing one of his dress shirts over her own clothes, her hair pulled back in a messy bun secured with what appeared to be a pen she'd stolen from his desk, and she was surrounded by a hurricane of documents, charts, and coffee cups that would have given Margaret a nervous breakdown. "Are you even listening to me?" Amora asked, looking up from her laptop with an expression of mock irritation. "Every word," Christopher lied, walking over to perch on the arm of her chair. "You were telling me how brilliant you are and how lucky I am that you decided to start your own consulting firm and make Bennett Enterprises your flagship client." "That's not how I phrased it," Amora said, but she was smiling now, that radiant smile that still had the power to make Christopher forget about stock prices and board meetings and everything else that used to consume his life. "How would you phrase it?" Amora set her laptop aside and turned to face him fully. "I was telling you that Williams Consulting Solutions has successfully improved operational efficiency for its most important client while simultaneously proving that federal investigations can't destroy companies that have competent leadership and transparent business practices." Christopher's smile widened. The federal investigation had been officially closed 2 months ago, with the Justice Department issuing a formal statement that Bennett Enterprises had been fully cleared of all allegations. The vindication had been sweet, but not nearly as sweet as watching Amora navigate the media circus with the same grace and steel she brought to everything else in her life. The reporters had been relentless, especially in the early days. They'd dug into Amora's background, questioned her qualifications, speculated about her motives for dating Christopher. But Amora had faced every interview, every intrusive question, every attempt to diminish her with the quiet dignity of someone who'd been underestimated her entire life and had grown tired of proving herself to people who would never be satisfied anyway. "Mr. Bennett," she'd said during one particularly aggressive interview with a financial news reporter, "Christopher Bennett could date any woman in the world. The fact that he chooses to be with me says more about my character than any speculation about my motivations ever could." The clip had gone viral. Within a week, 3 other major consulting firms had reached out to offer Amora positions, and 2 venture capital firms had expressed interest in funding her own consultancy. She'd turned them all down, choosing instead to build something from the ground up, something that was entirely hers. Speaking of competent leadership, Christopher said, trailing his fingers along her arm, the board meeting this afternoon is going to be very interesting. Amora raised an eyebrow. Oh, why's that? Because I'm going to officially announce that Bennett Enterprises is partnering exclusively with Williams Consulting Solutions for all efficiency optimization projects moving forward. A 5-year contract worth. Christopher paused dramatically. Well, let's just say it's enough to ensure that WCS will be one of the most successful consulting firms in the city by this time next year. Amora stared at him, her mouth falling open slightly. Christopher, you can't be serious. Completely serious. You've saved the company more money in 6 months than our previous consulting firm saved in 3 years. The board would be crazy not to lock you down. But people will say that Christopher Bennett is smart enough to recognize exceptional talent when he sees it, Christopher interrupted gently. They'll say that he's practical enough to secure the best consultant in the business for his company's long-term success. And if anyone suggests that our personal relationship influenced this decision, they'll have to explain how our personal relationship also influenced a 23% improvement in operational efficiency. Amora was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what he was offering her. A 5-year contract with Bennett Enterprises wouldn't just make her financially secure, it would establish her as a major player in the consulting world. It was everything she'd dreamed of when she'd first walked into this building 6 months ago, clutching her portfolio and her hopes. There's one condition, Christopher added, his voice suddenly more serious. What's that? Christopher slid off the arm of the chair and knelt beside her, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. The condition is that you let me make this partnership personal as well as professional. Amora's hands flew to her mouth as Christopher opened the box to reveal a ring that caught the morning sunlight and threw it back in 1,000 brilliant fragments. It was beautiful, elegant but not ostentatious, classic but not predictable. It was exactly what she would have chosen for herself, if she'd ever dared to dream about such things. Amora Williams, Christopher said, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his body. 6 months ago, you crashed into my life and changed everything. You made me remember what it feels like to be human. You showed me that there are things more important than quarterly reports and stock prices. You loved me when my world was falling apart, and you stayed when any rational person would have run. Tears were streaming down Amora's cheeks now, but she didn't look away from his face. You're brilliant and brave and beautiful, and you make me want to be the kind of man who deserves you. You're my partner in business and in life, and I can't imagine facing another crisis or celebrating another victory without you by my side. Christopher took a shaky breath. Will you marry me, Amora? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the woman who saw something worth loving in a billionaire CEO who'd forgotten how to be anything more than his net worth? What's the most romantic proposal you've ever witnessed or experienced? Love has a way of finding us when we least expect it. Share your love story in the comments below. Amora was sobbing now, tears of joy and disbelief and overwhelming love for the man kneeling beside her chair. Christopher, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, of course, yes. Christopher's hands were shaking as he slipped the ring onto her finger, and when he looked up at her, his own eyes were bright with unshed tears. I love you, Amora Williams. Soon to be Amora Bennett. I love you too, Amora said, pulling him up for a kiss that tasted like forever and new beginnings and the kind of happiness that poets spend lifetimes trying to capture in words. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying and holding each other like they never wanted to let go, Christopher rested his forehead against hers and smiled. So, he said, I guess this means you accept the consulting contract too. Amora laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the morning-lit office. I suppose I do. Though I think we're going to need to establish some professional boundaries, Mr. Bennett. I can't have my clients proposing to me in the middle of quarterly reviews. I think I can manage to keep my hands to myself during board meetings, Christopher said solemnly. But I make no promises about what happens after hours. After hours, Amora said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I think the CEO of Bennett Enterprises should probably get very familiar with the head of Williams Consulting Solutions. Purely for the sake of synergy. Synergy, Christopher repeated, his voice low and warm. I like the sound of that. They spent the rest of the morning in Christopher's office, alternating between discussing business strategies and planning their future together. By lunch, they'd outlined a timeline for their wedding, a small ceremony in Detroit, followed by a reception at the plaza for Christopher's business associates, identified 3 potential locations for WCS's new headquarters, all within walking distance of Bennett Tower, and agreed that their honeymoon should involve somewhere tropical with excellent coffee and absolutely no cell phone service. I should probably call my mother, Amora said as they shared Chinese takeout from Christopher's conference table, a practice that would have horrified his previous assistants but which Margaret had adapted to with remarkable grace. Your mother who still thinks I'm too old for you? Christopher asked. My mother who thinks all men are too something for me, Amora corrected. Too old, too young, too rich, too poor, too ambitious, not ambitious enough. She's very protective. She raised an incredible daughter, Christopher said seriously. I'm grateful for her protectiveness. It helped make you who you are. Amora reached across the table to squeeze his hand. She's going to love you, you know. Eventually. Once she gets past the fact that you're a billionaire and realizes that you make me happier than I've ever been in my life. And your grandmother. Grandma Rose is going to take one look at you and declare that you're too skinny and that I need to cook for you more often. Amora grinned. She's also going to ask you if you know how to change a tire and fix a leaky faucet, because in her opinion, no man is worth marrying if he can't handle basic maintenance. I can change a tire, Christopher said proudly. And I'm pretty confident I could figure out the faucet situation with the help of YouTube. That's all she needs to hear. As the afternoon wore on, news of their engagement began to spread through the building. Margaret had apparently noticed the ring during a routine check-in, and had spent exactly 30 seconds maintaining professional discretion before breaking into the kind of smile that suggested she'd been planning this moment for months. By 3 p.m., Christopher's phone was buzzing with congratulations from board members, business associates, and friends who'd watched him transform over the past 6 months from a workaholic recluse into a man who left the office at reasonable hours and smiled at random moments throughout the day. The board meeting that afternoon was, as Christopher had predicted, very interesting. The announcement of the consulting contract was met with unanimous approval. The board had seen the quarterly reports, after all, and understood the value of keeping exceptional talent in-house. The announcement of the engagement was met with a standing ovation and several toasts with champagne that Margaret had somehow procured despite having no advance notice. To Christopher and Amora, said Harrison Wells, the board's longest-serving member and Christopher's grandfather's oldest friend. May their partnership be as successful in marriage as it has been in business. To the woman who taught our CEO that there are more important things than quarterly earnings, added Patricia Vance, raising her glass with a smile that suggested she'd never doubted this outcome for a moment. To love, said Margaret simply, and everyone drank to that. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and promise, Christopher and Amora found themselves back where it all began, in the 8th-floor corridor outside Conference Room A. You know, Amora said, leaning against the wall where she'd stood 6 months ago, trying to work up the courage to walk into what she'd thought would be the most important meeting of her career. If someone had told me that missing my presentation would lead to the best thing that ever happened to me, I would have laughed in their face. If someone had told me that getting investigated by the federal government would introduce me to the love of my life, I would have had them committed, Christopher replied, standing in the exact spot where he'd been talking to his lawyer when Amora had crashed into his world. Do you ever think about it? Amora asked. About how many little things had to go exactly right for us to meet. If the subway hadn't been delayed, if the meeting hadn't been rescheduled, if your lawyer hadn't called at that exact moment. I think about it all the time, Christopher admitted. And I think that maybe some things are just meant to be. Maybe the universe was tired of watching us live half-lives and decided to give us a push. A literal push, in my case. The best push either of us ever got. Amora smiled, looking around the corridor that had witnessed the beginning of their love story. I suppose we should head home. Tomorrow's going to be busy. We have a wedding to plan, a consulting firm to expand, and a life to build together. All of that, Christopher agreed. Plus I promised I'd cook dinner tonight. Something about proving to your grandmother that I can handle basic life skills. You're going to cook? Amora's eyebrows rose. Christopher Bennett, Billionaire CEO, is going to stand in a kitchen and prepare an actual meal. I'm going to try very hard not to burn down my penthouse while attempting to make something that resembles food, Christopher corrected. I figured I should start practicing basic husband skills. Amora laughed, the sound echoing off the marble walls and polished surfaces of Bennett Tower. Well, when you put it like that, how can I resist? They walked toward the elevator hand in hand, the engagement ring on Amora's finger catching the hallway lights and sending tiny rainbows dancing across the walls. As they waited for the elevator to arrive, Christopher pulled Amora close, breathing in the scent of her perfume and marveling at how completely his life had changed. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For crashing into me. For staying when things got complicated. For loving me enough to risk everything. For showing me that the best things in life can't be quantified in quarterly reports or measured in stock prices. Amora reached up to cup his face in her hands, her thumb stroking across his cheekbone. Thank you for helping me pick up my scattered papers. For seeing me as more than just another consultant with a presentation. For making me believe that I deserve someone who loves me exactly as I am. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and as the doors slid open, Christopher couldn't help but smile at the symmetry of it all. 6 months ago, they'd been two people rushing toward separate elevators, separate lives, separate destinies. Now they were stepping into the same elevator, heading toward the same future, together. You know what I just realized? Amora said as the elevator began its descent. What's that? We never did have that proper presentation. I never got to show you my charts and graphs and carefully researched recommendations. Christopher grinned. Well, Mrs. Soon-to-be Bennett, you'll have plenty of opportunities to present to me over the next 5 years. And after that, we'll negotiate a new contract. A new contract? Lifetime partnership, Christopher said, pulling her close as the elevator carried them down toward the street level, toward the city, toward the life they were going to build together. Exclusive, renewable every day for the rest of our lives, with benefits that include but are not limited to shared coffee, mutual respect, unconditional love, and the occasional collision when one of us needs reminding of how lucky we are. Amora stood on her tiptoes to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promise. That sounds like the best contract I've ever heard. Then you'll sign. Already did, Amora said, holding up her left hand where the engagement ring caught the elevator's soft lighting. Sealed with a kiss and witnessed by the entire board of directors. As the elevator reached the ground floor and the doors slid open to reveal the marble lobby where their love story had begun, Christopher Bennett and Amora Williams stepped out into the world together. Two people who'd found something worth more than all the money in the world. Something that couldn't be investigated or audited or quantified. They'd found each other. And sometimes, in a world that moved too fast and valued the wrong things and forgot that the best stories often started with accidents, that was everything. The revolving doors of Bennett Tower spun behind them as they walked out into the New York evening, hand in hand, hearts full, future bright. Somewhere in the city, other people were rushing to catch elevators, chasing dreams, building lives. Somewhere, other love stories were beginning with collisions and coffee and the kind of bravery it took to believe that sometimes the best things happened when you least expected them. But for Christopher and Amora, their story was just beginning. And as they disappeared into the crowd of people making their way home through the streets of Manhattan, they carried with them the knowledge that love, real love, was worth every risk, every scandal, every moment of uncertainty. Because the best love stories, after all, always started with something crazy. And the best love stories never really ended. They just kept getting better, one collision at a time.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.